Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle King from TIEMS, and today is going to be day one of the conference. And if you haven't seen the agenda, we've already put the link in the chat. And of course, we'll cover some administrative instructions and things like that just really quickly before we actually get started. So, of course, since we're starting to get everybody to come into the room and to filter in and everything else like that, why don't we go ahead and just have you drop in the chat where you're joining us from? That'd be good to sort of understand the presence and where everybody is currently today. Also, do keep in mind once we get started that there are going to be some scheduled changes coming up and things like that. I'll go over the procedures really quickly as we move forward into the conference this week. For example, you might have heard Harold talking about how we have some presentations from Ukraine presented, but given the war and things like that are happening, sometimes we have to be very flexible with those that are attending from Ukraine if they want to present some information. So things might change, but we'll always keep the schedule updated. And of course, the chair for the day will be providing an overview accordingly. We will get started unless, Harold, do you want to open up the conference? And then we'll go into the agenda and administrative remarks.
I just say hello to everybody. Welcome. The official opening is actually tomorrow, so I will leave more of this to you now, Kyle. I will just say hello to everybody, and Kyle is our chairman today, and I've been following it in the background. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Harold. We'll go ahead and begin by Joseph Leitman to discuss institutional arrangements for post-war recovery, which should be quite interesting given the context and the nature of the world events these days, and especially since our Ukraine speaker is actually, unfortunately, currently stuck in Kiev and things like that under a bunker and air raid warnings. So, Joe, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks. Thanks for presenting early.
Sure. Thank you, Kyle. And it's a pleasure to be here. Very sorry about our Ukrainian speakers and the challenges that they're facing. I feel a bit embarrassed to be here in the safety of California to present, but let's go ahead and share some ideas. And let me start by sharing my screen. Well, I'd like to drill down on an issue that maybe isn't in people's minds right now, but will become important when hopefully soon peace breaks out in Ukraine. And that is, how do we manage the recovery process? It's not something that happens automatically. It needs to be thought through. And this is a good time to actually think these things through so that we're prepared to rapidly begin recovery when it's feasible. Of course, people are recovering on a day-to-day basis, but what we're talking about is the massive influx of Ukrainian and international resources that will be available once it's possible to have a stable recovery. So what I'd like to cover is, what are the responsibilities of recovery management, and particularly the institution or set of institutions that will be engaged in recovery. Then I'd like to look at how we can assess the existing institutional capacity in the Ukraine, and then go over the three basic models that are out there for institutional arrangements, looking at the positives and negatives of each of these models, and then putting forth 6 criteria that the Ukrainians might want to consider as they design their management arrangements. And finally, mention a few very Ukraine-specific factors that might affect the recovery process. And I'll try and do that in a succinct way. So to begin with, a recovery institution really has 8 or 9 responsibilities. And the first one is to assess the damages and losses. And this is very important because it performs several functions. It allows you to determine where resources are needed, both in terms of sectors and geographically. It also helps to inform any sort of international pledging conference or donor arrangements so that people know the magnitude of the disaster, in this case, the crisis following a war. The second role is to assist in the planning and programming and policy development. Now, everyone knows that you need some sort of master plan or guidance for recovery, but that has to be translated into programming. Who's going to get what resources and how are they going to be implemented? And then you need to have the right policies in place. And this is very important to think through before the recovery to enable the management of the recovery, but also to enable specific policies. For example, who is going to be eligible for grants to rebuild their homes? Are there cutoffs? And what are the criteria that will be used? Third, a recovery agency or a recovery manager can mobilize the resources, both domestic and international, for recovery. Next, there's a role to be played in building capacity for that management process. Coordination is a critical function that needs to happen at three different levels. There has to be coordination between the central government and the local governments in the Ukraine. There has to be coordination across the central government agencies. And then there needs to be coordination between the government and its international partners. Another key function is communications. It's critical that the people of the Ukraine get a very clear idea of how the recovery process is going to unfold and what their role is in that process, how they can access resources to rebuild their lives and their livelihoods. And it's very important to have two-way feedback. It's not just the government telling the people what's going to happen. It's the people and other stakeholders who need to provide feedback on how the recovery is going. Next, monitoring and evaluation is kind of a bread and butter responsibility of a recovery entity. And that involves looking at where progress is vis-a-vis some sort of results framework for the recovery, reporting back and making mid-course corrections. Then, once the recovery is coming to an end, it will be necessary for the recovery entity to hand over its responsibilities and its assets in a transition process. And then the last role is an optional one because it doesn't happen in very many recoveries, but sometimes the recovery entity is involved in the direct implementation of recovery activities. So those are what needs to be done to manage the recovery process. When it comes to institutional capacity, before you decide on what kind of framework you want to manage the recovery, you really need to know the capacity that's out there already. And this can be done today. Ukraine has a pretty strong governmental system, both at the national and the local level. But what we need to know is, does the country have the capacity to conduct damage and needs assessments up to international standards? What kind of responsibility or experience do government agencies have in recovery, for example, from the 2014 events? What is the policy making and regulatory and legal framework? What kind of leadership can be brought to bear, and are the proper and appropriate staff in place? What is the capacity for stakeholder engagement and public participation? What is the arrangement that will be put in place for financial management and budgeting, which is critical in a country that ranks, 120th out of 180 countries in Transparency International's corruption index? What kind of monitoring and evaluation capacity exists? And finally, what kind of communications capacity exists? And there are existing models out there, existing tools out there that enable the capacity building assessment or the capacity assessments to be done. The United Nations has one of these tools, the capacity assessment and planning tool of the UN. That can be used. The EU has a tool, the Red Cross has a tool, or you can simply do an after action review, for example, of the 2014 response that will allow you to identify strengths and weaknesses at the institutional level. And this can be very important. For example, when after the Canterbury earthquake in New Zealand, they did a capacity assessment. they discovered that the existing institutions, the Ministry of Civil Defense and Emergency Management, did not have the capacity to handle a large-scale event like the earthquake there. And so it was necessary for the government to put in place new institutional arrangements. So once you've done your capacity assessment, you need to consider the opportunities that are out there for developing a framework for managing recovery. The first model is to take what you have in place already and strengthen it and put in place a coordination mechanism. So the features of this model are that you've got some entity or some either existing or new entity that can coordinate to set recovery policies, to lead the development of an action or recovery plan, to be responsible for overall assessment of progress across government agencies, and to resolve the inevitable institutional and jurisdictional issues that arise in a complex and large recovery process. The implementation is done through the existing capacities of line ministries and or local authorities. It really depends on the system that's in place. And this capacity is used both for planning and for implementation. And it may need to be strengthened in certain cases. Then you've got to ensure that these line ministries are accountable to some sort of central coordination authority for consistency in planning, to follow common guidelines for recovery, to be accountable for the use of recovery funds, to report through a monitoring and evaluation framework, and then to resolve those administrative disputes. There are a couple of variants of this that are presented in the paper. And the first is the variant where you have a centralized government system where typically you will put in place a high-level advisory committee, an executive committee, or a recovery task force to handle the coordination role. And that task force in large events is usually accountable to the highest level executive, the president or the prime minister. Another variant is when you have a more decentralized system. And there's an example of the first variant in the case of Chile after their earthquake. But in countries like India, where you have a much more decentralized governance structure, then there's another variant that needs to be put in place, which is a coordination mechanism at the local or at the state or provincial level that allows all of the relevant and powerful local authorities to work together in a consistent and unified fashion. So our second model is something that doesn't happen that often, but it often happens when there's a very large disaster. And that is that there's a need to establish a new governance body because of the magnitude of the disaster or weaknesses in the existing governance structure. So this new agency typically will develop the vision for recovery, develop a recovery strategy, do the planning, sometimes implement, and certainly coordinate an overall multi-sectoral and large-scale reconstruction program. This, as I said, happens where there are situations where the government agencies are unlikely to be able to coordinate amongst themselves and have the capacity to implement very large scale and numerous additional recovery processes at a speed that is accelerated. They may be too taken up with their routine public service duties. And the need to do this can be financed by bringing in resources from other relevant government agencies, be that financing or staff, through a secondment process, by mobilizing private sector consultants, by creating short-term government assignments, and by seeking means to recoup money that is lent to the agency. There are a few variants of this that are covered in the paper. In the interest of time, I won't go into them. And we've got examples of the recovery agency established in Indonesia after the tsunami, which had a sunset clause. It was only in existence for 4 years. And the day that it was supposed to go out of business, it turned over its assets to the local government and national government agencies. And then they were responsible for the remainder of the recovery process. In Serbia, this is the second variant, the agency that was set up to handle flooding recovery then was transformed into a permanent government entity with recovery as one of its other responsibilities. So you can either have this new agency have a short lifespan, or it can transform into a permanent government agency. The final option is more of a hybrid approach. And here, the example is where the government structure is likely to be adequate to handle the recovery process, but there's a need to really strengthen the centralization of authority in a single unit, a department, or in the case of Haiti, which we'll talk about in a second, an external commission that is dedicated to the recovery. This central entity provides that overall guidance and coordination and some support services to the reconstruction program. And it serves as a single point of coordination, both for the local, national, and international stakeholders. It is given the power to ensure the inclusion of relevant government agencies as well as other stakeholders, the private sector and civil society in all phases of the recovery. And it has the flexibility of working at the local level and with non-government partners to delegate implementation responsibilities. So it's using the existing government structure, but creating a central entity and empowering it to do more. It typically does not engage in planning of the recovery. That's left to, in a central system, the Ministry of Planning. And it does not implement. That is done by the line agencies and or local governments. The variants that are in the paper are the case of Turkey after the earthquake, where a high-level body was set up to coordinate across government agencies, and the very different case of Haiti, where an international commission was established to perform that role. And in a sense, Haiti ceded some of its national autonomy to this commission to make some decisions about the recovery process. So very quickly, some pros and cons of each of the models. On the first model, where we are strengthening the existing government arrangements, it's available, it's there, it's ready to use. There's already ownership of the process because these government agencies have been doing work over many years. The cost is lower. You don't have to build a lot of capacity, and you can leverage the existing capacity. The difficulties of this approach are that many of the line agencies and local governments may not be able to handle a multi-sectoral, cross-jurisdictional and programmatic recovery. It can be difficult to set priorities when the line ministries may be competing against each other. There isn't obvious coordination. There may be a need for a special authority, which doesn't exist, and there may be capacity challenges as well. With the new agency, you have an entity that is powerful and has autonomy. It has a clear mandate to manage the recovery process. You can gear the capacity to the needs. There is accountability, especially for procurement and financial management, and it's possible to coordinate, particularly across sectors. The difficulties with this approach are that there are transaction costs and delays anytime you start up a new institution. In Indonesia, it took 3 to 4 months to set up the new institution. And so the recovery kind of floundered during that process. In Haiti, it took 6 months. There's also the risk of alienating and possibly duplicating the role of the existing line ministries. They can be jealous and resist the authority of the new agency. The fact that you're drawing some of the best staff from other government agencies for this new one can reduce the capacity of the line ministries or local governments. And you may need to pass legislation to set up the agency. And there's also the possibility of friction with local authorities and local communities. The final model has some pros and cons. It can work in either of the variants, centralized or decentralized. It's very flexible in terms of how it can be staffed. You give international partners a single one-stop shop to work with, and it actually builds the capacity and strengthens existing structures and has many of the advantages of the first and second models. The disadvantages are that it can be costly. It may be difficult to put it out of action once it's been set up. And there may be a loss of institutional memory if it is put out of action too soon. That was certainly the case in Haiti after the earthquake. So what do we need to do to make a choice between these three different models? I think the first is to look at the characteristics of the war, and particularly the damages and losses to infrastructure, to services, and to capacity. And the magnitude of those damages will help decide whether something new is needed or we can use existing capacity. Looking at the existing governance structure and whether it's adequate to the task will also be an important criterion, and we can get some of that information from the capacity assessment that I mentioned earlier. The government's prior experience with managing recovery can be very important to identify strengths and weaknesses and needs. And then the convening power of the government at the local and national level is important. In weaker states that don't have that convening power, it may be necessary to set up a new agency. And then the credibility of the government can be important. If the credibility is low, you may need to invest in a lot of both communication and capacity building. And then the capacity at the line ministry or local government level can be very important to help you determine which model to apply. And so just very quickly, some examples of applying the criteria. If you're dealing with a relatively small crisis, a decentralized recovery institution at the local government level could be the best arrangement. But if the conflict has occurred in a country where recovery management capacities are limited, then it may be necessary to create a new dedicated recovery agency. If the war has happened in areas where there is previous experience with recovery programs and projects, it may be possible to rely on an existing government agency or an interagency entity to manage the recovery process. And if the event has cut across many sectors and jurisdictions, there's likely a need for a high-level coordination body. So those are just examples of how the characteristics of the crisis or the war in this case can affect your choice of institutional arrangements. And then finally, there are some specific factors in the Ukraine that will influence the recovery management process. The first is that many people have called out for a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine. And this is something that really needs to be looked into more carefully from an institutional perspective. Many people take the Marshall Plan as just a big effort by the US and the international community to help Europe rebuild with a lot of financial resources. But in fact, when you drill down and you look at the institutional implications, there was a massive ceding of national sovereignty to the US, which made a lot of the decisions about how Marshall Plan resources were used. I don't think that that's an institutional arrangement that the Ukraine wants. So it's important to really understand what we're talking about when we talk about a Marshall Plan. Next, it's going to be very critical because of the extent of the war-related damages to do an ongoing assessment. And the Ukraine has the capacity and is doing this, and that's very important. What will be useful at the end of the day is to do a final damage and loss assessment that not only looks at what we call the damages, which is the cost of replacing damaged or destroyed infrastructure, including housing, but also the losses. And that is what has been the economic impact on productivity. How has Ukrainian productivity and the economy lost out because of the impact on the ability to produce goods and services in the country because of the war? And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, that Transparency International ranking for the Ukraine does indicate that there is international concern about the prevalence of corruption and the need for good governance in the Ukraine. And that need has been recognized for a long time. So you have procedures in the Ukraine to be transparent about the procurement process, to be transparent about budgeting, and about contracting, and then using a virtual community that exists in the Ukraine to monitor the spending during the recovery process. A lot of money is going to be flowing into the country, and there's going to be a high level of concern that that money gets well spent. So that's a lot of information. Let me stop there and open it up for any questions or comments. Over to you, Kyle.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, so it's an interesting sort of challenge that's coming up in terms of the reconstruction. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in terms of, specifically in the context of this conference, we're talking about emergency services and emergency management and these other fields. From my sort of experience in working with international organizations, not a lot of people focus on the emergency management and emergency services aspect, or at least if they do, it's in sort of very limited sort of methods, right? What are your thoughts on sort of the unique nature of the war that's happening in Ukraine, and in terms of just this, how the lines between, say, the military side and the security side are now blurred with more civilian side now, I think now more than ever. And will that have an impact in terms of how we do reconstruction in the future?
Yeah, I think that obviously a lot of the resources that are going into the country now are to fight the war. I think if you look at the budgeting, very little money has been raised for the emergency response side compared to the military support side. There have been 3, I think, international pledging conferences for the Ukraine. And whereas the pledges have been impressive, the actual delivery of resources has been modest, to say the best. So what's critical, my focus has been on recovery, but there is a very critical linkage between the emergency response and the way that recovery is handled. And I'll just give you an example. After the tsunami in Indonesia, there was a military response to help clear the debris. There were several million cubic meters of debris that were blocking roadways and access to communities. And the military just pushed that off into productive agricultural fields because their concern was speed. And then we had to spend tens of millions of dollars to recover and reposition that waste and recycle some of it because a bad decision was made kind of early in the process. So that emergency response, or once we get into a more stable period, that early recovery can really determine the parameters of the broader recovery process. And it's important to already be thinking and building in smart decisions that have long-term impacts rather than just thinking about how are we going to fix this immediate problem. So that would be kind of my concern from a longer-term recovery perspective.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And not to, I know it's early for you in California, but not to sort of, get into a deep discussion before your coffee kicks in, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting because given the speed of events changing in Ukraine, and I think you're right, having to sort of have these more nuanced, more strategic decisions in place, but having to deal with speed of response. How do you balance between those two?
Well, I think that the overwhelming bulk of the effort has to be on response, saving lives, protecting people and property, and getting emergency services up and running and as effective as possible. But you do need a core of people who are thinking longer term and who are coordinating with the emergency response folks. And ideally bringing them into the recovery process because they are people who are on the front lines. What often happens in countries that have less capacity is all of that capacity is going into emergency response. And no one's thinking about the long term. And then when they have the opportunity to, there's this hiatus, 3 months in Indonesia, 6 months in Haiti. In Indonesia was even worse because they hadn't thought through the budgeting process, and it took them 9 months after the tsunami before government money could be reprogrammed to spend on reconstruction. So you can short circuit that kind of problem by having a core of people who are already thinking about recovery. And to be honest, I don't know Ukraine very well. I've met with the executive director for the Ukraine at the International Monetary Fund, who is thinking about these things and trying to coordinate at the level of the international community. I don't know about what's actually going on the ground in the Ukraine itself.
Okay, thanks for that, Joe. It's very, very interesting discussion to see how things sort of develop. And I think it's also, at least for me personally, very interesting to see how there's really a direct parallel between, say, reconstruction and recovery, both in the international sort of crisis space, but then also as we draw parallel to our own communities and recovering after, Hurricane Ian or whatever the case is, in the United States as well. Some very strong parallels between the two.
Yeah, and as I said, it's very important to acknowledge and build on the structures that have been set up for emergency response and management. Again, another problem that happens is people go, okay, well, those guys are finished with their work, and now we're going to bring in a whole different set of actors. Those people have incredibly valuable knowledge at the local level and have developed a community of practice, a kind of a social infrastructure or social capital that should be used and not neglected.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that. Okay. Is there anything else, Joe, that you had or that you wanted to present?
No, I'll be back in a few hours to make a very different sort of presentation, but thank you for the flexibility and apologies for not putting the TIEMS background on. I'm not sure if I got that. So I'm sure Harold will let me know how I can put it up for my next presentation.
No problem at all. All right. Yeah. Thank you for your flexibility since it is a Monday. So we're sort of working through the kinks this morning. So I really do appreciate that. And certainly, how can anybody find you if they want to get in touch with you, Joe, or have any questions?
The email is jlightman@gmail.com.
Okay, great.
Happy to follow up as needed.
Perfect. All right. Thanks a lot.